period. So I want to welcome everybody to this course on Sephardic Jewry. I think we all know who we are, but I'll introduce myself. I'm Richard Whitland, and my co-faculty member for the class is Sheldon Hirsch, and he just waved his hand. Sheldon and I have created this course based on our own readings and our own research. So I guess any things that we get wrong or any opinions that you don't like, you can blame it on us because we created this. The course is going to start with the beginnings of the Jewish presence in what we today call Spain, which the Romans called Hispania. And it's going to go all the way from ancient times through the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. The current status of Sephardic Jewry in America, in Israel, and the rest of the world is going to be discussed. I want to give everybody a little heads up that we have in lecture 4 a guest speaker. His name is Ethan Marcus. He's the president of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, who will be able to really talk about Sephardic customs, Sephardic liturgy from a very personal point of view. You also may know this, that the rabbi is not on the call today. Yitzchak had surgery and she's with him, but she will be joining us for the next several sessions to give us her expert opinion. And so I'm going to present the first half of the course, which Sheldon and I have kind of decided is the good part, because we start at the beginning and we will go towards the ascent to what is called the golden age of Sephardic Jewry. And then there is going to be the descent, the gradual decline in the status of Jews with the Spanish Inquisition and the ultimate expulsion. It's a fascinating and complex story that hopefully we will make in a clear way. It still resonates today. Sheldon is going to say a few words, and then the rest of this lecture will be mine. Sheldon.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, and I also want to welcome everyone to our class on Sephardic Jewry and the Golden Age of Spain. Sephardic Jews have a unique history, and the Golden Age of Jewish Spain was an exceptional period of calm in the tumultuous history of the Jewish people across the ages. This period of Jewish advancement ended abruptly in 1492 with the expulsion of Jews from Spain. From the destruction of the Second Temple in the 1st century until the Nazi Holocaust in the 20th century, the Spanish expulsion was the worst tragedy to befall the Jewish people in almost 2,000 years. As Richard has said, he will chronicle the history of Sephardic Spain and the ascent of Jews into the Golden Age, and I will discuss the descent of Sephardic Jewry, including the Inquisition, the expulsion, the Sephardic diaspora, and present-day Sephardic Jewry. We begin with a 4.5-minute video to give you an overview of the course. The video is produced by an organization that combats anti-Semitism on campuses. The video has no talking, only text and music, but Richard and I will discuss these issues that are raised in the video later in our course. And after the video, I'll turn the program back to Richard. Jenny, please.
Thank you, Sheldon. So my lecture today is going to primarily focus on the history. I think anybody who's taken the other course that Sheldon and I did know that establishing context, understanding the history helps us understand the environment that the Jews lived in. So, and then next week, I will be presenting more specific examples of the type of poetry or the type of cultures that they created that made it the Golden Age. We are all comfortable. We had a conversation at the beginning with certain conventions about what being Jewish is. We speak a certain way. We've learned to pray a certain way. The synagogue looks and feels a certain way. We eat a certain kind of food. But almost all of that is Ashkenazi. Almost all of that is from Northern Europe. We are going to need to open our minds to what it is to be a Jew and what makes somebody Jewish. So, question, is this Jewish music? We know the answer is obviously yes, but it's not what my grandmother I never listened to. But as we're going to learn, this is Jewish music.
So there are multiple Jewish identities. I wanted to spend just quickly at the beginning to talk a little bit about Mizrahi Jews. I think we would be remiss not to mention it. I think Itzhak would be very disappointed if I didn't say something about it. So with the emergence of Zionism in the late 19th century, there was a series of waves of Jewish immigration. And the earliest Jews came from Eastern Europe and Russia. And then there were waves of Jews, Ashkenazi Jews from Germany and Western Europe, and a smattering of Sephardic groups from Greece and the Balkans. So the early foundation of the modern state of Israel were pretty much done by Jews of Ashkenazi descent, the results of which that many of the early government and legal codes and military have a Western European basis. However, with the foundation of the state of Israel, 500,000 Jews from Muslim countries were expelled, and most of them emigrated to Israel. So this huge influx of non-Ashkenazi Jews created great tensions within the state of Israel. Related to the Sephardic Jews are what we call Mizrahi Jews. These are Jews of Middle Eastern or North African ancestry. The oldest communities were those from Iran, Iraq, like Yitzhak, Morocco, and Yemen. These are Jews who never left the Middle East, and they lived under Muslim rule for many generations. Today, most of them live either in Israel or the United States. As a matter of fact, almost half of Israeli Jews are Mizrahim in ideology. Now take a look at this, because someone said earlier, well, I didn't really know any Sephardic Jews. So in America, 90% of Jews are Ashkenazi, 1% are Mizrahi, 3% are Sephardic. Look how different it is in Israel, where the Sephardic Mizrahi combinations are almost 50%. So it's very different when we think of Jews, and I think Israelis think of Jews. The largest influx of Mizrahi Jews occurred in the 50s and 60s. And at the beginning, the dominant Ashkenazi establishment really weren't thrilled with them, and they did face significant challenges in terms of education and work opportunities within the state of Israel. They are very similar to Sephardic Jews, which is what we're going to speak about the rest of the course. Mizrahim traditionally spoke a Judeo-Arabic language, as opposed to Sephardic, which spoke Ladino, which was a blend of Spanish and Hebrew. So they are a little bit different, but they are quite similar. And as you can see in Israel, there's a progressive blending of the two. Mizrahi culture, which was once marginalized, has now become mainstream. And they become quite powerful politically. The Shas party, which Netanyahu just aligned with to form this coalition, is now a very prominent coalition partner. So what started off as a marginalized, somewhat discriminated against group is now mainstream and powerful. We're now going to talk about Sephardic Jewry for the rest of the course. So these are Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. The term Sepharad probably originated somewhere in the 10th century. The Jews at that time were so proud of what they had accomplished that they named themselves Sepharad. It probably comes from a book, the book of Obadiah, and there's a quote, "The exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad will inherit the cities of the Negev." One of the things that you will pick up in this course is there is a different approach that the Sephardic Jews took to the world around them than the Ashkenazi Jews took. Sephardic Jews tended to integrate very well into the surrounding Arabic society while maintaining their own religious separation. Whereas the Ashkenazi Jews really tried to maintain a separation. They were more inward-looking, more insular within the community. The Sephardic Jews tended to be more assimilationist, if you will. The outside world was viewed by European Jews as fundamentally toxic and dangerous. It may date from 1096, the horrible massacres that were associated with the first Crusaders as they passed through the Rhineland on their way to the Holy Land. Because when you put things into context and you take what's happening in different places at the same time, the Ashkenazi Jews were being massacred, but Maimonides is writing commentaries on the Torah, on the Talmud. He's creating poetry about love, about drinking, and he's writing both in Hebrew and in Arabic. And these events are happening simultaneously in different parts of the Jewish world. So again, Sephardic is more outward-looking, combining secular and religious traditions. Ashkenazi tends to be more inward-looking and more insular. Sephardic Jews would convert. We're going to be talking about that. Whereas Ashkenazi Jews set a pattern of mass suicide. If the rabbi was here, she would be better able to talk about the concept of martyrdom and Kiddush Hashem, this mass suicide rather than converting and giving up Judaism. Two different approaches dealing with the same problem. Sephardic Jewry is located in the periphery of the Jewish world. Where's the historical center of Judaism? It's in Israel. And even after the destruction of the temple and the first diaspora, where did it shift? It shifted to Iran and to what is today Kuwait, the Talmudic academies at Sura and Pembandita. So there was a geographic separation between the Iberian Jews and the center of Jewish life and Jewish living. The Talmud was written in mostly Aramaic, which, as we had discussed in our class, was really the vernacular language of Babylonia and in that territory. But the Spanish Jews did not speak or read Aramaic. They lacked local Jewish experts to read and understand the Talmud. They were also a very long way from Sura and Pembandita. There was no Federal Express. So if they sent a question, if they had a Talmudic question and they sent it off to get an answer, it took 2 or 3 years before the reply made its way back. So they sort of had to come up with their own way of doing it. So I have a story, the story of the 4 captives. It's a very exciting story. You can take out your potato chips and popcorn because it involves kidnapping and pirates. For centuries, the yeshivas of Babylon, the birthplace of the Talmud, they were the center of Jewish learning. But as is wont to happen to universities, they need money. So around the 8th century, they did what Talmudic academies do. They went looking for money. So they sent out fundraisers. But because the situation was so dire, they didn't send out anybody. They sent out 4 prominent rabbis, okay? This is supposedly a true story. So they all got together, they got on a ship, but you know, the Mediterranean back then was not a very nice place. And there were storms, there were pirates as well. And the pirates looked for booty. And they knew that one of the things that you could do is you could kidnap people and sell them in the slave markets. Well, the good people to capture were prominent Jews. Why? Because Jews have a mitzvah that is called Pinyan Shavuyim. It is a great mitzvah to rescue Jews who've been kidnapped. Judaism is not a museum religion. There's no value in having a Torah if you don't have any Jews to read the Torah. So the Jewish communities would go out of their way to rescue people. So they are captured by a pirate ship, and he goes along his way. His first stop is in Egypt. He ransoms one rabbi to the Jewish community there. He ransoms another one in Tunisia to another one. He gets to Cordoba and he ransoms the last of the rabbis, Rabbi Moshe ben Enoch. And the Jewish community there ransoms him. And he is, according to the story, a very modest man. He gets a job working in the great Jewish Academy in Cordoba, but he kind of like cleans up and, doesn't really, until one day, the local rabbi says something and he offers a Talmudic opinion. And they realize that he's somebody special, a greater man than the local rabbi. And this helps stimulate the Jewish community in Cordoba. It becomes a sense of great teaching. And so the diaspora happens. Judaism is spread because of a pirate and because of the Jews. So, when you're eating the pirate booty popcorn, realize there was something positive about it. So Sheldon's going to spend more of talking about this, but there is certain terminology you may need to know. One is a converso, which is a Jew who converted to Roman Catholicism, particularly during the 14th or 15th centuries, or one of their descendants. The majority of Spain's Jews converted to Christianity as a result of the pogrom in 1492, which Sheldon is going to explain, but you need to know the term converso. There is another term called Morisco, because the Jews weren't the only ones that the Christians had out for. They didn't like the Muslims that much either. And so this refers to Muslims who converted to Christianity. So they were secret Muslims. And one other thing that I want to point out, we are very much aware of the Jewish expulsion. Well, the Christians did the same things to the Muslims. It just took them longer to do it. On September 22nd, 1609, King Philip III expelled all of them, about 250,000 people. So while we're mainly concerned about what happened to the Jews, realize that the Christians were really attempting to create a monotheistic peninsula. Anybody who wasn't a Roman Catholic, they didn't want around. So this is a map of the Iberian Peninsula as we envision it today, the modern country of Spain and Portugal. But that's not where our story begins. The Romans defeated the Carthaginians in 218 BCE. And then the Romans invaded the Iberian Peninsula. And they slowly defeated the native tribes that were living there. And what we think of as the Iberian Peninsula was the Roman province of Hispania. And Rome ruled this area for 600 years. It was an important food source for the Roman Empire. They imported grain, olives, and wine. And some very prominent Romans, including two of the emperors, came from Hispania. When we try to say, when were there Jews? When were there first Jews? There are some vague references in the Bible and Talmud, but there really are no good Jewish records. The first Jewish record actually comes from a tombstone that we can identify. And it's the 2nd century of the Common Era. There is a tombstone of a little baby girl. And this is what the tombstone says. It was located in the little village of Adra. Here lies Nia, daughter of Solomon, aged 1 year, 4 months, and a day, a Jewess. This is the first proof that we had that there were Jews living in this part of the world. After the destruction of the temple in 70, this map shows you the diaspora, the first diaspora, where the Jews were spread out, especially as the Romans kicked them out of the land of Palestine. So the Jews lived throughout the Roman Empire. When the Romans reached the Iberian Peninsula, it is likely that they took Jews with them. They may have come initially as slaves, but there were definitely Jews living in this part of the Roman Empire. How do we know this? By the 4th century, there was changes happening. The Roman Empire was starting to degrade and disintegrate. So the fall of the Roman Empire did not happen all at once. It happened gradually over several hundred years. Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And one of the first councils of Christian church leaders in Iberia took place near the modern city of Granada. This was the Synod of Elvira in 305. This was a series of rules of how the Christian community should behave. Amongst the 70 rules that were promulgated, 3 were directed against the Jewish community. So we know that there were enough Jews living here at that time to come to the attention of the local Christian clerics. So what did they say? Rule number 1, it's kind of interesting when you learn. They prohibited Catholic girls from marrying Jews. So obviously, even back then, there was a certain amount of interaction between the communities. Rule 2, if any cleric eats with a Jew, if he breaks bread with a Jew, he will be punished. He will be kept from communion as a way to correct him so that the Christian would make amends. And 3, landlords were not allowed Jews to bless their crops. And anyone who had their crops blessed by a Jew would be expelled from the church. The farmers weren't stupid. They wanted a good crop. So it was okay if the priest blessed, but why not play it safe? We'll get the Jews to do a blessing. But if you got caught, you got kicked out of the church. We also know that the Apostle Paul traveled throughout the Roman Empire seeking to convert Jews to Christianity. And there is a quote in Romans, I'm not that familiar with that part of the New Testament, but Paul writes that I plan to do so when I go to Spain. So after I have completed this task and have made sure they have received this contribution, I will go to Spain and then visit you in Rome. So Paul was going to go to the Iberian Peninsula to see what he could do to convert the Jewish community there. As I mentioned, the Roman Empire was declining, and they were being pressured by the Germanic tribes, who in turn were being pressured by the Huns. So the Germanic tribes were pushed westward and southward. And with the sack of Rome in 476, the Visigoths, which is a collective name for Germanic tribes, took over the Iberian Peninsula. So the Romans are gone. The Jews are no longer living under Roman control. They're living under the Visigoths. But at the beginning, the Visigoths didn't really care. There really was very little anti-Jewish legislation. And there's a pattern until what? They convert to Catholicism in 587. Recared I becomes Catholic, and there seems to be a pattern. They now want to prove to everybody that they're really good Catholics. Well, how do you do that? Well, there's 125 years of intense and escalating anti-Jewish persecution. The laws become pretty draconian. The Jews are oppressed. And when you see what they decide to do, you realize that there's nothing original under the sun. The Germans didn't have to invent new things in Nuremberg laws. They were able to go back, and they had 2,000 years of history to see how do you do it. So if somebody was caught learning from the Torah, they received 100 lashes. In 613, there was a decree of the Jews either had to be forcibly baptized or expelled. So the Jews fled or they became secret Jews, conversos. So it happened during the Inquisition, but again, the Jews learned how to survive. This happened during Visigothic times. But despite all the persecution, despite these draconian penalties, the Jewish problem didn't go away. There were still Jews. So it should come as no surprise to anyone when the Muslims or the Moors first appeared on the scene in 711, the Jews said, you know, maybe these guys are not so bad. We know what's going on now is not so good, so maybe this is better. Maybe they offered the Jews a better deal for a better life. So we're going to have to spend a little bit of time talking about the spread of Islam. It was pretty amazing because if you look at the Islamic world under Muhammad, it's that little tiny orange area. But within the space of 100 years, Islam spreads all the way from the Pillars of Hercules, from the Atlantic, all the way to India. And that was only in 100 years. So this rapid expansion of Islam, the Muslims came in contact with many non-Muslims, and they had to figure out a way how to deal with this non-Muslim majority. And they developed a notion of what we call dhimma or dhimmi, protected people, people of the book. And this applied to Christians and Jews. So although they were still second-class citizens, Jews were granted many freedoms, such as the freedom to practice their religion, the freedom of occupation, they could do what they wanted to do, and the freedom of settlement. These are all very valuable, just so long as they were always second class and the Muslims were always superior. And this was codified in what has been known as the Pact of Umar. This was in the early days of the Caliphate. The people of the book, it outlined the legal status that there was a trade-off. In return for being second class, they also were granted certain protections. So the Jews or the Christians could not outshine Islam. For instance, they could build temples, but the temples had to be smaller than the mosques. In return, the Jews had to pay a special tax called a jizya, and they had to act and dress in such a way where they did not outshine the local Muslims. On a positive note, the Jews were exempt from military service. So the Jews had limited autonomy but they had full rights to practice their own religion. So they had to pay a tax, which was higher than what the Muslims paid. So it was kind of a good deal. The Muslims could finance a lot of what they wanted to do by taxing the Jews, and in return, they kind of let the Jews be Jews. So now we're in the year 711. The Visigoths at this point are a series of kingdoms. There's nobody really in control. And a couple of them go, there's these bunch of Muslims just across the Mediterranean. Maybe we could get them to help us defeat the other Visigothic tribes. So they kind of invited them in. So in 711, an army of Muslim soldiers that we would call Moors invaded. As it turned out, be careful what you wish for, because the Muslims were much better fighters than the Visigoths. And they rather quickly defeated Roderick and all of the Visigothic kingdoms. And they kicked the Visigoths out of all of the Islamic peninsula, all of the Iberian Peninsula, except for a tiny strip up north.
As the Visigoth kingdom of Hispania was struggling to stay afloat in 711, North African Umayyad governor Tariq ibn Ziyad led thousands of his Muslim warriors into southern Spain. King Roderick led his own men against the invaders, meeting them in the south at the Battle of Guadalete. Though there is a severe lacking of contemporary sources recounting the events of the invasion as a whole, we know that the Battle of Guadalete was decisive and brought about the death of the Visigoth king. How the monarch died is not entirely clear, but it's speculated that a portion of the Visigoth army refused to support the alleged usurper king, and thus either withdrew entirely or at a minimum pulled back enough to allow the Muslim attackers to surround the fighting portion of the Visigoth troops. The latter was then routed, and Roderick was slain in the final leg of the battle. Now, the door was wide open for Tariq and his men to push forward. The surviving Visigoths remained divided and at odds with each other, and the Muslims soon gained reinforcements under the command of Musa ibn Nasir. Aside from a small region on the northern border, the Umayyads had seized the whole of the Iberian Peninsula in only a few years. Their next challenge was to set up a new administration to manage what would now be named Al-Andalus. However, this was not altogether difficult for the Muslims to do. While religions and cultural differences between the invaders and their victims were stark, much of the Visigoth elite hadn't cared all that much about supporting their kingdom anyway, and thus would do whatever they were asked in order to protect their own power. This led to a series of agreements between the Umayyads and Visigoths, which ultimately kept life fairly consistent for the conqueror's new Christian subjects. Many of the local Christians, nevertheless, would soon begin converting to Islam.
So the Jews actually did much better living under Muslim rule than Christian rule. And that's going to be a theme that you're going to hear throughout this course. Judaism and Islam are actually closer structurally than Judaism and Christianity. And Islam freely borrowed from Judaism. Whereas Christianity, I think, sort of had a chip on its shoulder and was more intent on proving that they were the superior religion to Judaism. And Islam, at least back then, was not. So it's not surprising that the Jews looked towards the Muslims as potential saviors because of the extreme persecution they received at the hands of the Visigoths. And the Jews actively assisted the Muslims when they invaded. They acted as loyal guardians for the Muslims and helped the Muslims establish their government. It is said that the Jewish population of Toledo opened the gates of the city and welcomed the Muslims invaders. Incredibly, the conquered cities of Cordoba, Malaga, Granada, Seville, and Toledo, for a time, were placed under the control of Jewish inhabitants that the Moorish invaders had armed. So very different stories than what you're going to hear latest. And so some of the highest ranking officials in Muslim Spain were Jews. The Muslims were not completely tolerant, but again, it's better than what they had. So recall the concept of dhimmis. The Muslim conquerors were mostly Arabic, but they were actually Berber tribesmen. So they all spoke Arabic, but they were not Arabs. But they did have the Arab language in common. So Arabic becomes the lingua franca of the ethnic groups in the Iberian Peninsula, including the Jews, who were Arabized and learned to speak and write in Arabic. So Arabic is the language of life in Muslim Spain for the Jewish, the Christian, and the Arab communities. So the conditions in Spain improved so much so for the Jews that Jews migrated to the area. It became the largest Jewish community in the world, and there is a period of time we are going to talk about called the Golden Age of Spain, almost 400 years, when Jews, Jewish culture ascended to great heights. And we will provide examples of Jewish poetry, Jewish science, linguistics, and philosophy, the Golden Age. Now, we have to talk a little bit more about what was happening to the Muslims, because remember, context, the Jews lived within this community. So you heard a group called the Umayyad. The Umayyad were one of the early caliphs, one of the early noble families of Islam. They ruled, and after Muhammad died, they led the Arabs out of the desert and into the Fertile Crescent, and they ruled the Arab world. However, in 750, there was a political upheaval. The Muslim world was centered in Damascus. A competing family called the Abbasids eradicated all of the Umayyads. The entire ruling family was assassinated, except for one young prince who becomes central to our story, survived. He fled westward and he wandered for 5 years, mostly trying to avoid getting murdered. And he finally pops up in the Islamic Peninsula in Spain. His name was Abdul al-Rahman I, and he establishes the emirate in the city of Cordoba. So he emerges several years later. He was born of a Berber mother and an Arab father. And because he was royal, the local Berber tribes rallied to his side. And in 756, he won a decisive battle over the local Muslims. He established his own capital. So remember, we now have the Umayyads. He is the only surviving remnant. He is only in the Iberian Peninsula. The Abbasids established a new kingdom, a new capital. They established the city of Baghdad, which was pretty darn far away. So they didn't really care what he did. So again, in summary, he unifies Al-Andalus under his rule. Okay, he conquers the rest of the Visigothic and Christian communities. He does establish a rule of war. And one thing we know about Jews, if you give us a set of rules, we can figure out how to work with it almost any time. Jews become wise and loyal servants. However, things are good while he's alive. He dies, and this caliph, this fiefdom that he established, falls apart, and it breaks up into competing little kingdoms. And there's fighting, disagreements, nobody's really in control. Until the next person, his grandson, who is probably the most pivotal. If you remember no other Muslim leader, this is the guy you got to know. Abdul al-Rahman III, the grandson. So he ascends the throne in the year 912, and he apparently was not only a pretty smart guy, he was a pretty good general. And he, over a period of 18 years, he conquers all the other Muslim kingdoms. He restores Umayyad rule across the Iberian Peninsula.
Allah died on October 16th.
So again, if you look at it, you see Abdul al-Rahman at the top of the family tree, and then you have a number of other rulers.
In the year
And
912,
then we get
he made it
Abdul
clear for some time
III.
that his grandson was to be the next in line to rule. While he was alive, he'd invite the young Rahman into his own private residence and allowed him to sit on the throne in his absence or during special occasions. The young prince was even given special responsibilities in order to groom him for the role of emir. Surprisingly enough, for a land in such disarray, Abd al-Rahman III's ascension to the throne was not contested, including by those who had been passed over for the role. His family and the upper nobility simply submitted to him with an oath of allegiance, and he was installed as emir. But who was this man? The new emir was remarkable. Physically, he was the embodiment of the mixing of cultures that was Al-Andalus. He had inherited his father's Middle Eastern blood, Islamic religion, and high title, but from his mother, who was a Christian concubine, and his grandmother, who was a Basque princess, he got his blue eyes, fair hair, and fair skin. Chroniclers recalled him as being a really handsome guy. The man was a pious Muslim, but he was able to think beyond the confines of his court, and under his rule, Christians and Jews had the ability to succeed. Indeed, these people were considered dhimmis, or people of the book, which offered them a certain degree of protection. This new ruler had an amazing ability to rule by employing the best and worst aspects of the carrot and the stick. Those who submitted were treated fairly. Many of his defeated rivals found new life in the court of Cordoba, where they were reintegrated as productive members of society, but masterfully separated from their base of support. Those who didn't acquiesce were savagely annihilated, entire families wiped out, castles and homes razed to the ground, and sometimes just to prove a point.
So he was a guy who wanted to be on the side. So he declares his own caliphate in 929, and he issued this issuance of the caliphate brought a new age that had been termed La Convivencia, which is a Spanish term meaning coexistence or living together, and where Muslims and Christians and Jews could live in relative harmony and openness. He was a major supporter of the arts and science, and Jewish intellectual life flourished. Jews were appointed to high positions. We're going to talk in particular about Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who became not only his personal secretary and personal physician, but he became the foreign minister of the caliphate. So Abdul al-Rahman ruled for almost 50 years, and he kept a personal diary. So he was the caliph, he was in charge. I think this is very interesting in his diary, what he wrote, and I'm going to read it, because when you think about power and having it all, it's kind of interesting. I have now reigned above 50 years in victory or peace, beloved by my subjects, dreaded by my enemies, and respected by my allies. Riches and honors, powers and pleasure have waited on my call. Nor does any earthly blessing appear to have been wanting to my felicity. In this situation, I have diligently numbered the days of pure and genuine happiness, which has fallen to my lot. They amount to 14. O man, place not thy confidence in this present world. It's kind of a very interesting, Paul, if we had time to talk about it, it's a very interesting philosophy. This is what he came up with, 14 days. Very interesting. So Cordoba, which we're going to talk about for a few minutes, was considered at that time the jewel of the world. This is, remember, around the year 1000. Cordoba had parks, it had paved roads, it had oil lamps to light the streets, it had 300 public baths, it had a massive public library with 500,000 books. And remember, this is pre-Gutenberg. All of these books were handwritten, more than any other library in Western Europe. Think about what was going on in Western Europe in the year 1000. So it was one of the greatest centers of learning in the entire world. It was considered the brilliant ornament of the world. Cordoba was its name. It was wealthy and famous and known for its pleasures and resplendent in all things, especially for its 7 streams of wisdom and its constant victories. It's a very beautiful place today, as Rick Steves will show you.
While Granada was the last Moorish capital, the capital through the glory days of Muslim rule was Cordoba. Tucked into a bend of its river, Cordoba has a glorious past. While its old wall evokes a tough history, its elegant cityscape and convivial squares show a modern pride. As is typical of Andalusia, it's a people-friendly city filled with energy and color. Cordoba's centerpiece is a massive former mosque, or in Spanish, mezquita. This huge rectangle dominates the tangled medieval town that surrounds it. Grand gates lead to the courtyard. It was here, when this was a mosque, that worshippers would gather to wash before prayer, as directed by Muslim law. Entering, you step into a forest of delicate columns and graceful arches dating from over 1,000 years ago. At its zenith, this mosque was the center of Western Islam and the heart of a cultural capital that rivaled Baghdad and Constantinople. A wonder of the medieval world, it's remarkably well preserved, giving today's visitors a chance to appreciate Islamic Cordoba in its 10th century prime. The columns and arches seem to recede to infinity, as if reflecting the immensity and complexity of God's creation. The mihrab, the focal point of worship in a mosque, was built in the mid-10th century. It's richly mosaicked with 3,000 pounds of tiny, multicolored glass and enamel cubes. A painting in the adjacent treasury takes us back to 1236, when Christians conquered the city and everything changed. Here we see the Spanish king accepting the keys to Cordoba's fortified gate from the vanquished Muslims. According to legend, one morning Muslims said their last prayers in the great mosque. That afternoon, the Christians set up their portable road altar and celebrated the first Mass in what would later become this glorious cathedral. As if planting a cross into its religious heart, this grand cathedral was built in the middle of the mosque. Taking 2 centuries to complete, the cathedral is a glorious mix of Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque styles. A statue actually called St. James the Moorslayer stands next to the altar. Sword raised as usual, James is busy conquering Muslims.
The golden age of Spanish Jewry. In the 10th century, Al-Andalus was about as good as you could find a place to live if you were a Jew. The Jewish community had grown and prospered. The Jews were Arabized, and they were accepted as members of the general community. So while they assimilated, they could remain devout Jews, they could practice their religion as long as they were dhimmis. They did very well in a commercial environment. So it was a good time to be a Jew, and that's why it is called the Golden Age.
The scene opens in 949. It's approximately 100 years later. Abd al-Rahman III now has complete power
So we're going to be talking a lot about this fellow, Hasdai ibn Shaprut.
over Al-Andalus, but make no mistake, his rise to power had its brutal moments, and the exhumed body of his greatest rival, Umar ibn Hafsun, which was put on display, gives testament to that. And if not this, then one only has to look to the Gate of Al-Suda, which was an entrance to his pleasure city of Madinat al-Zahra, which served as a glorified place of execution, similar to England's Tyburn. However, the Emir, who now turned Caliph, had united Al-Andalus like never before. He ushered in a period where you had a booming economy, a military supremacy, and cultural ascendancy. This made Cordoba a rival with Baghdad and Constantinople as one of the most civilized places on earth. This, while most of his Western European neighbors didn't even use forks. His right-hand man and vizier during this high point was Jewish. Hasdai ibn Shaprut, the son of Isaac, was a Renaissance man before there was a Renaissance. He was born in Cordoba in 915 during a bright time for the Jewish community. The economy was good, and a frenzied trade throughout the Mediterranean was bringing in the latest innovations, music, fashions, and new ideas. The Jewish community embraced this and prospered. Maria Menachal in her book comments on this, quote, "Under the Dima brought by the Muslims, the Jews, who in Visigoth Hispania had been at the lowest end of the social and political spectrum, were elevated to the status of people of the book, alongside the Christians, for whom it was instead a demotion. This granted them the ability to participate freely in all aspects of civic life. This freedom meant virtually unlimited opportunities in a booming commercial environment." End quote. Menachal goes on to clarify the reason for their success. Quote, "Of course, at the heart of the Jewish community's prosperity lay an enthusiastic attitude about Arabization, which meant full cultural assimilation. The Jews' position under Muslim rule was in every respect an improvement as they went from persecuted to protected minority." End quote. Hasdai grew up in a Moorish Spain where education was not far out of the reach of most people. Indeed, the Jewish community was able to not only grow and add to their own cultural heritage, but were also able to contribute to the expanding Arabic libraries on philosophy, poetry, and science. Thus, the man spoke Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, Mozarabic, and came to the attention of the Caliph, who recognized his abilities, which included his elegance in speaking and writing, and who had a profound knowledge of Andalusian and Islamic culture. So, it's not surprising that he was quickly elevated to the high office of vizier. Now, in the year 949, the Caliph had enough faith and trust in the man that he placed him at the head of a delegation that met with a diplomatic envoy from Constantinople. They met in the Caliph's famed pleasure palace city of Madinat al-Zahra to discuss an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. And while no military endeavor was agreed upon, there was still considerable amount of cultural exchange. The mosaics in the Great Mosque of Cordoba give a perfect example of this. But the Byzantine also gave Al-Andalus several books, including the manuscript of Dioscorides, which was called On Medicine. This was written in Greek, which was a bit of a problem as no one actually spoke it, despite being a polyglot society. However, the Eastern Roman Emperor also sent a monk translator to teach the Caliphate, and before long, Al-Andalus was doing its own Greek translations. This was a particularly great present as Hasdai, who aside from being a philosopher, a diplomat, a vizier, and head of the Jewish community, was also, in his spare time, a doctor. And he specialized in antidotes to poisons, if you're wondering, which made him even more valuable to the Caliph.
So just a little bit more about Hasdai. So he is a foundational figure in the golden age of Spanish Jewry. And it was interesting that his specialty was antidotes to poison, which if you're a caliph or a king back then, It's really good to know, because that was one of the ways to get rid of you. He does well, he becomes vizier, but and by being a vizier and being in charge of foreign policy, it puts him in touch with numerous Jewish communities across the entire Mediterranean basin. So he was the Nazi, the leader of the Jewish community in Spain, as well as the diplomatic emissary between the Jewish communities. And so he regularly wrote correspondence. He was also an important patron of religious scholarship. He built schools, he built academies, he purchased books. So he was very instrumental in creating this birth that we call the golden age of Spanish Jewry. We're going to talk, this is an interesting story, which you may or may not know, about the kingdom of Khazaria. Is anybody familiar with it? It's very interesting, assuming it's not a Bubameister, which is a Ashkenazi term. According to the story, Khazaria is an area north of the Caspian Sea that converted en masse to Judaism in the 8th century. Is this a myth, or is this story real? Did it happen? If it is, whatever happened to this kingdom of Khazaria? Or was it only the elite members of the society that converted? And if they were Jews, what kind of Jews were they? Hasni was very fascinated by this story. He was fascinated there was a possibility that there existed a Jewish kingdom in the 940s that was supposedly about a 15-day mule ride northwest of Constantinople. So he attempts to open diplomatic correspondence by sending letters, by messengers, but they have to go to Constantinople. The Turks aren't so happy to let these Jews continue on their way, so they stop the messengers. He tries again via a different land route. It's very unclear from the sources if any of these messages ever were received. But several hundred years later, a response is received from, allegedly, from King Joseph of the Khazars, is discovered. Is this a legitimate response, or is this a medieval forgery?
A lot of questions about the convivencia. Maybe we'll return to it. But at any rate, one of the early figures in the 10th century was an individual named Chastai ibn Shaprut, who rose to prominence in Cordova, and he actually became one of the most important ministers within that city, representing the region of Al-Andalus with all kinds of diplomatic correspondence. He was actually a medical doctor, and he treated patients in Christian regions as well as Muslim regions. Fascinating things. But at any rate, for our purposes, he was especially interested in learning about far-flung Jewish communities, and he wanted to use the power of his office to try and protect them and promote their interests and to promote Jewish unity. He really thought on a global level. And when he heard about the possibility of Jews living north of the Caspian Sea in the region of Khazaria, he was especially interested in learning more about them and trying to understand, what is the story with these Khazarian Jews? Now, we'll get to the actual story of the conversion of the Khazars shortly. It occurred about 200 years prior to this correspondence. But just to look at this map here, you can see that Khazaria is located north of the Caspian Sea, in the region which would be today Ukraine, especially eastern Ukraine. And it is notably distinct from the Christian regions to the west and the Muslim regions to the south. That will become very significant in just a moment. At any rate, according to the history of the documents as we have them, Chastai ibn Shaprut sent messengers out to Constantinople hoping to reach the kingdom of the Khazars. However, when they got there, they were blocked by the local Byzantine authorities, who would not allow these messengers from Spain to traverse the territory and make their way up there. And so they were forced to sit tight in Constantinople, which is, by the way, in contemporary terms, Istanbul. So they're sitting there, and they passed off their letters, and which apparently, according to the story of the correspondence, made their way to Khazaria, and a King Joseph read the letters from Chastai ibn Shaprut in Spain and composed a response. This was an amazing thing. When it reached Chastai ibn Shaprut in Spain, it was such a tremendous, it's like getting a letter from the moon. Oh my gosh, Jews in Khazaria? Who are they? How did they get there? And so on. So I have to burst a bubble right now and suggest that it is very likely that these letters themselves were forged, that they were not actually communicated to a King Joseph and then returned from Khazaria to Spain. That does not necessarily mean that there were not Khazarian Jews in Spain, but that this particular set of correspondence is probably a forgery. Let's look, though, at some of the evidence for Jews in Khazaria. Just one piece, which I find most fascinating. This is a document from the famous Cairo Geniza, and it dates roughly from this period, a little bit later. It's actually a rather remarkable document. It is a little tzettel. It's like or a kvittel. It's a document asking for financial charitable support for a traveler who comes apparently from the city of Kiev. You can see here, there's one, it's a little bit hard to read, but it looks like the letters Kuf, Yuf, Yud, Yud, Vav, Ves, which would spell Kiev or Kiev, and it appears to be a document from Khazaria. This is reinforced by the fact that at the bottom, you actually have these Khazarian runes written, which translate to the phrase, I have read it.
I'm going to have to move on because of time. So the golden age for Jews was a new kind of Zion. There was more than 100 synagogues. The Jews were rich. They were cultivated, and they engaged in all types of poetry and philosophy. And as I said, this is called La Convivencia. This is the tomb of King Ferdinand III. It's a little hard to see in the pictures, the best I could find, but the inscriptions on the side of the king's tomb are written in 3 languages. And they're written in Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew. So the question is, how much of this is idealized remembrance and how much was real? We have to understand, this is my opinion, that tolerance in the modern liberal sense of full equality was never the goal. The adherents of the religion in power always considered it their right to treat non-believers as inferiors. And for the most part, the Jews were happy to be, they weren't really happy, but they accepted this inferiority. As long as they were permitted to practice their religion without too much interference or overt violence, they were really okay. And so long as they stayed within this dhimmi system that was set up, and they really weren't limited as they were in Christian Europe, where they could only do money lending, but they could really enter into everything, they were really okay. Jews were very comfortable interacting with Muslims. They spoke and wrote in Arabic. So they were very comfortable with their environment. Unfortunately, persecution still happened. Less common than Christian Europe, but they happened to occur. Sheldon will go into this in much more detail. In particular, as time went on, there were other groups of fanatical Muslim Berbers who came into the Iberian Peninsula from North Africa. These are, you're going to hear 2 names in particular. And the thing with these Muslims is they were sort of like the more radical fundamentalist Muslims today. And they were not happy with this tolerance. There was a big pogrom against the Jewish community in Granada in the year 1066, where over 1,000 Jewish families were murdered. the caliphate itself breaks up. There is infighting amongst various Muslim groups. And so kind of what some of them did, they invited these North African Muslims to come in and help one side defeat the others. So these small groups of city-states invite in the groups that are called Almorids and Almohads. So these are groups of Berber tribesmen who come into the Iberian Peninsula and kind of take over, and they become the dominant group. The important point for our story to remember is that these groups were fanatical, strict Muslims, and they were disgusted by the fact that the other Muslims let the Jews rise to such important positions. They were making money, they were viziers, they put a stop to it. And so Jews left. They moved to the Christian communities up north. And I'm moving along a little quickly because we need to get to this, the Reconquista. So remember, the Muslims controlled most of the peninsula, but there was a little area up at the north that remained Christians. And over a period of several hundred years, there was an ebb and flow where the Christian kingdoms gradually reconquered this disjointed and disorganized Muslim kings. And if you look, Leon and Navarra basically remained Christian, and the rest was Islamic. Now you're going to see the tables being turned.
Now, there's a few really interesting phenomena that are going on at this time. First, this is the era of the greatest of the Spanish court Jews. This is an institution which we'll see examples of it throughout Europe, but Spain in many ways has some of the greatest examples. Court Jews, it's hard to really translate that appropriately. It's related to the idea of being in the king's court, like a courtier is sometimes, you see that word. It's something like a lobbyist or sometimes a government official, typically associated with some kind of fiscal activity. They often don't have any specific role in the court, but they're very much part of the ruling circle, advising kings, very frequently underwriting the king's activities, and exercising a tremendous amount of power. Quite often, these courtiers are also the titular heads of the Jewish community, so chosen because they are so close to the levers of power and are able to protect the community appropriately in that way. But quite often they are heavily resented by the larger non-Jewish population, and sometimes they suffer terrible falls from grace because they're intimately associated with the king that they serve. We see this, for example, with the great Don Isaac Abarbanel, or Abravanel, who of course was exiled from Portugal, and then later he would be exiled from Castile, from Spain as a whole, and spent the last few years of his life wandering around, and it's really amazing, remarkable that he accomplished so much literary material when he was in exile from these places. But he's a good example of a Spanish court Jew, and the Spanish Jewish communities in Catholic northern Spain actually had phenomenal levels of authority, partially because of the tremendous strength of their courtiers. In particular, in Castile and in Aragon, the Jewish leadership was very much involved in an institution called tax farming, which we have discussed briefly in other classes, but let us just quickly recall what we're talking about here.
Suffice it to say that the Jews collected the taxes. Now, if you were a farmer and the person coming around to collect the money from the IRS was Jewish, After a while, you weren't too happy about Jews because they were the ones showing up, knocking on your door, collecting the king's taxes. So the Reconquista took several hundred years. As I said, it was not a linear process. It was an ebb and flow with Christian and Muslim infighting amongst themselves, but gradually the Muslims were in retreat and the Iberian Peninsula became Christian again. The turning point happened in the year 1212. It was a battle. It was a resounding Christian victory, and it was the clear beginning of the end of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. Cordoba, we talked about Cordoba, fell in 1236, Seville in 1248, and the last Muslim or Nasrid kingdom of Granada fell in 1492. So the Almoravids arrive in 1086, and over a period of several hundred years, the Christians regain control. They expel the Muslims. They are not so nice to the Jews. The tables are turning. So briefly, 1492 is a miracle year. The positive, Granada surrenders to Isabel and Ferdinand, which is Aragon and Castile. The last Arab kingdom is conquered. They sign a peace treaty, which Isabel and Ferdinand immediately disavow and do not respect the Muslim rights. Religious unity is achieved. The Alhambra decree, the expulsion of the Jews, the edict is issued. And by the way, if you remember in 1492, Columbus discovered the New World. So it was a pretty big year. Lots of stuff happened. Jews had been expelled before. The Romans expelled us in the Bar Kokhba revolt. England expelled the Jews in 1290. By the way, that lasted until 1650. We don't hear that much about it, but it took the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell let Jews back in. They were expelled from France in the 14th century until the Russian Revolution. And as Sheldon will explain in much more detail, in the late 15th century, we were kicked out of the Iberian Peninsula. Very briefly at the end, the last thing I want to touch on today was the other thing that the Christians liked to do was they liked to try to prove that Christianity was the superior religion. So they engaged in these things called disputation. And the idea was to get the Jewish rabbis together, have them in a very public venue, and then have them questioned by the Christian clergy. And in most cases, the outcome was a foregone conclusion because the rules were such that the Jews couldn't win. But we were going to pretend that this was going to be, an open forum. And the idea was to force the Jews to convert. Failing that, it was a good excuse to burn Jewish holy books or Talmuds. This picture, you can see this drawing from that day. It's easy to see the Christians. They're the ones with the books open, looking up. See how the Jews, they're wearing these funny hats. Their books are closed. They're looking down. You can kind of see. The only one I want to talk about, because it was a little bit unique, was the Disputation of Barcelona. The Jewish representative was a very famous Rabbi Nachmanides, and the king actually gave him freedom of speech. The disputation was held in the court of the king, King James of Aragon. And the main questions of debate centered around the Messiah, whether the Messiah had indeed come, and whether the Messiah was divine or whether it was a human being. It's interesting when you search around YouTube, somebody actually made a movie. I'm not sure why they would make a movie about the disputation. So I'm going to show you 3 minutes of the movie. The movie this scene opens in the middle of the disputation. They probably spent $5 making the movie. And if you've ever heard the scene chewing the scenery or overacting, you'll see that. But it's kind of interesting because the rabbi actually comes out pretty well. So bear with me, we're almost done. It's about a 3-minute video.
Your Majesty. Only the devil himself would have such. We must have patience.
I have heard that this blasphemous rabbi is an adept at their black magic, which they call a Kabbalah.
He is an expert Kabbalist, Your Majesty, but the Kabbalah is not black magic. It's a kind of mystical philosophy. It contains no invocations of the devil.
Tell me the truth, Kabbalah Christiani. Did you never see black magic practiced when you were a Jew? Did you never see Christian children sacrificed and their blood used for unholy purposes?
Never. Such things are unheard of in the Jewish faith. I tell you, they're not an uncivilized people, they're over-civilized. They think themselves too clever to need salvation. Well, we must out-argue them, as Christ himself did when he condescended to argue with the Pharisees.
May I remind you that the first question has already been debated. So far, Rabbi Moses seems to be out-arguing us.
Who knows what effect my arguments are having on him?
I see little sign of him breaking down. Are we to allow his insults to Christ to go unpunished?
The king has ruled that he must be
If I
subject...
had my way, I would have him broken on the wheel. I thought it was just obstinacy that made them refuse to acknowledge Christ.
She's not really overacting too badly, is she?
They look upon us as unenlightened heretics and idolaters.
Your Majesty. At last you are beginning to understand the extent of the problem. I speak plainly. I think it unlikely that we shall convert the rabbi, or bring about a mass conversion by this disputation. As I see it, what we need is a long campaign. This is only the beginning.
I want to get to that.
That a man or a divine being. And the Psalms state quite clearly that he is the divine Son of God. This is my son. This day I have begotten thee.
The people of Israel are called in Scripture the firstborn son of God. Does this mean that they're divine? The truth is that all human beings are the children of God. Why else do we call God our Father? So the Messiah is no more the Son of God and no less than all the rest of us.
The Talmud says the Messiah existed before the creation of the world. How can this be unless he is divine?
You have misread the text, Brother Pablo. It says that the thought of the Messiah existed in the mind of God before the creation of the world. How could God create the world without a plan? And the Messiah is the culmination of God's plan for the world.
How can the Messiah be a mere man if he is, as you say, the culmination of God's plan for the world? How can the world be saved by a man?
The Messiah does not save the world. The world must save itself by turning to the light of God's teaching. Then the Messiah will come.
How can man save himself?
How else can he be saved?
Man is helpless. He is sunk in the sin of the fall of Adam. The coming of the Christ Messiah was to save him, and now he is saved in the great body of Christ, the church. Outside that, he is lost.
When Adam sinned, he sinned for himself, not for me. He was a man. I am a man. And each of us is responsible for our own sins and for no one else's. Why should I be damned because of Adam's sin? Or need a divine Messiah to come and rescue me? Or need a mother church to go back into her womb?
If Jesus is not divine, what is he then? Is he a devil?
No.
But you say he deceived mankind by claiming to be God. He must then be a deceiving devil.
My study of your New Testament has shown me that Jesus never claimed to be God. The church has perverted his teaching into idolatry.
Is Christianity then idolatry?
The first commandment says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." To worship a man as God is idolatry, the same idolatry of which the Egyptians were guilty when they worshipped Pharaoh and the Romans when they worshipped Caesar.
I think you get the point. I'm not sure why somebody made the movie, but as I said. Anyhow, at the end of this disputation, the king awarded Nachmanides a prize of 300 gold coins and declared that never before had he heard an unjust cause so nobly defended. So this is the one time when the Jews actually won. The Christians, the Dominicans, claimed victory anyhow, and as a result, Nachmanides was banished from the kingdom. He settled in Palestine in 1267, founded the Ramban Synagogue in Jerusalem, which is the second oldest synagogue in Jerusalem that is still active to this day. So we somehow seem to find ways to pop up no matter what happens. So anyhow, this is the end of week one. That's me and my lovely new bride, my wife, at the Alhambra Palace. In week two, we have now covered the history. I will give you examples of the different cultural and philosophical advances. We will be talking about Maimonides and other people that you have heard. I'm going to be trying to read you some poetry as well. And then Sheldon will take over and we will go from the poetic heights and we will start our descent. Any comments or questions? Anything I can clarify? Or did I thoroughly confuse you? And by the way, if you really want to watch the rest of the movie, you can probably find it on YouTube. I would suggest having some schnapps or some whiskey first.
When the Moors conquered Spain, they stopped at the Pyrenees. Was that when the legend of Roland was promulgated?
Well, the legend of they actually tried to get beyond, but they were defeated in southern France at the Battle of Tours. Was where they were defeated in 722. So that's as far as they got. So they never quite captured after that battle, they never tried again to get that far north. I hope that helps.
Yes.
That's as far as they got. Any other questions or comments? If not, I hope you found it interesting. There was a lot of ground that I covered. I moved a little quickly towards the end because I really didn't want to miss the movie. So anyhow, we'll see everybody next week. I hope you had a good week. If you think of anything that you'd like to talk about, please feel free to email me. I hope you found it an interesting way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. Thank you.